Over the last 40-year period of rock music, there have been a number of bands who indisputably at one time have been the biggest band in the world, and certainly the Police, when they made Synchronicity, were that.
They were getting on so badly at that time that they didn't really want to be in the same room together. It's amazing that the album did actually come together.
I think all of us can say now, we shake our heads in bewilderment as to how such a hostile environment could have produced music that we're all really proud of.
If you put all four of us in a room together and you said, did we feel satisfied? Sting might say, yeah, but I think other three would say, well, we would have really liked to close the deal. And I don't think, we really did.
The Police were one of Britain's most globally successful musical exports. They were formed in the UK by American drummer Stuart Copeland just after the explosion of punk rock in 1976. He recruited ex-teacher Gordon Sumner, known as Sting, on vocals and bass after seeing him at a gig in Newcastle. Not long after, Andy Summers joined on guitar, who, in his mid-30s, was a comparative veteran of the London music scene. They tried their peroxided best to ride the punk rock bandwagon, but they were never really accepted by the punk elite. Here's music journalist John Pidgeon, one of the Police's earliest champions.
Their original repertoire was these punky songs that Stuart had written, which Sting kind of yelled along to, and everything was mile a minute and, not very subtle. And then Sting started writing, and the more he wrote, the more the Police's music changed into the music that we got to know as the Police.
Thanks to Sting's fast-developing songwriting abilities, the band soon chalked up a series of UK hit singles such as Roxanne and Walking on the Moon. With slick, radio-friendly pop songs like that, it wasn't long before they started to find success in America. Here's the drummer's brother, Miles Copeland, the Police's enigmatic manager.
The reason the Police worked in America, I think, is because the Americans were ready for something new. Some kind of new vitality, which was the same reason the punk thing was happening in England. But in England, it was sort of an anti-musical movement. The bands were saying if you can play your instrument, that somehow you're not going to have a political stance. So the Police came along with this new energy, with all the stuff that was sort of working in England, but they could also play, and they had great songs. So in a sense, they were a good adaptation for what America wanted. They wanted something new, but they didn't want it too new to be so alien that they go like, what? That thing's out of tune,
The first two albums went by really easily and quickly, and we were on a roll.
Drummer Stuart Copeland.
And we're all on the same page. The third album, Zenyatta Mondada, is the first time when we now had an expectation to produce hits. We had two hit albums. People were saying, where's the number one hit single? And Stingo was under more pressure than the rest of us because he had to write those hits.
But write them he did, and 3 huge hit singles, all penned by Sting, featured on their fourth album, Ghosts in the Machine, released in 1981. This single, Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic, reached number 3 in the US charts, and in 1982 they won Best British Group at the Brit Awards. Whilst all 3 members had become international rock stars, the focus of attention fell on the photogenic Sting, who'd also branched out by this time into acting. As well as significant roles in The Who's Quadrophenia and Dennis Potter's Brimstone and Treacle, Sting had also secured a big part in the huge-budget sci-fi blockbuster Dune. The band was beginning to feel the strain of going from zeros to heroes in just 5 years. Drummer Stuart Copeland.
Well, there was the general insanity of being an individual that is personally the goose that is laying golden eggs. For a rock star or a movie actor, you are the product. You are the can of beans. And a lot of rewards for that, but it's weird. I'm telling you, it's weird. People think that, I'd love to be that, but I'm telling you, there's a weirdness that goes with it.
It was the pressures of wealth and fame that provided Sting with much of the material for Synchronicity, their 5th album. Here he is in 1989.
Synchronicity involved my family life. It involved success and the pressures of success. It involved becoming a rich man after having been poor all my life. it's a double-edged thing. You know, it's nice to make a lot of money, but it also brings a lot of problems with it. You know, what do you do with it? You know, where do you put it? Do you deserve it? What about all the poor people in the world? I mean, all of these things, if you're a thinking person, you have to deal with. And we were asked to deal with it over a very short period of time. We went from being church mice to being wealthy. And I know I sound like I'm glad I've got money. I'm not saying that's not true, but when you first get it, it's a problem. That's why a lot of rock stars lose it immediately. It's a combination of incompetence and guilt. And so really, what came out in Synchronicity was the result of all that pressure.
In 1982, their collective wealth enabled the three members to fly to a Caribbean paradise to record their next album. Little did they know it would be their last.
Montserrat is just unbelievably idyllic. Each member of the band had a little villa with a swimming pool and a house staff and just views out over this unbelievable scenery. And every morning we would wake up to the sun coming over the volcano, and we would be whistling a happy tune as we drove up to the Air Studios, which was a big, huge estate where George Martin had built this unbelievable studio. Once we got to the studio, things kind of went downhill from there. The happy tune that we'd be whistling as we came up the hill would turn into a dark, bitter dirge.
Like most bands, the Police had always done their fair share of bickering. But from the very start of the Synchronicity sessions, it was obvious that the problems were more serious than usual. It all stemmed from the early days when all three members had shared songwriting duties. However, as time went on, it became increasingly obvious that it was Sting who could deliver the big hits. Music writer John Pidgeon.
Sting can't have had any notion of what his potential was as a songwriter. I don't think you can go, I've progressed from Roxanne to this, to that. What's my next song going to be like? He probably took himself by surprise, and I'm sure he took the other two by surprise.
By the time it came to recording Synchronicity, Sting arrived with fully finished demos and wasn't really in the mood for altering his vision.
It was a democracy with arguing. They wanted to succeed, which was the element that pulled them together. They would listen, but Sting was not, let's say, as adventurous as Stewart would be. Okay, I think the dynamic was probably similar to John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney tended to be straight, and John Lennon would throw the monkey wrench in. And that's sort of what Stewart and Sting did. And Andy was sort of a peacekeeper between the two in a way. But the monkey wrench helped, I think, in the same way that John Lennon helped Paul McCartney not be so bland,
Drummer Stewart.
What's in my head now, looking back on it, is how ungrateful we must have been, because we were in this unbelievable, idyllic location, living the dream, and we were miserable. We were very angry at each other. We were just wound up.
Producer Hugh Padgham.
After 2 weeks, the recording was not going well at all, and there was a bit of a crisis meeting. Miles Copeland flew over, and I remember we had a meeting by the swimming pool just outside the studio, and basically the meeting was, are we going to call it a day, or are we going to try and make a record, It was quite close to possibly the band splitting up there and then.
Manager Miles Copeland remembers that other issues affected the recording process.
There was a crisis moment, so I flew to Montserrat to sort of basically, the policeman had to come and put everybody in line, But this was never a group in which you were really fighting a constant battle with drugs and all that sort of stuff. But, when you get to be as big as they were, the temptations get thrown at them constantly, And I guess a few weeks had gone by in which the temptations got a little bit larger than they should have been. Somebody had to come in and say, okay, guys, come on, let's get together here.
The album sessions continued, but the band were somewhat disconnected, recording in 3 separate rooms.
I do remember we had Stuart's drums set up outside of the studio because I didn't feel I could get a very good drum sound in the studio. So they were set up outside in the sort of dining room area.
I was going crazy up there in the dining room, and I could see a screen. I could see the other two guys, downstairs. I could see Sting go in the control room. I didn't have a camera on Andy, so I don't know what Andy's doing, but I could see Sting looking grumpy. And I'm up there going, what? We just did a take. Silence. Are we going to play that again? Does anybody have any comment? I'm sitting there. Would somebody tell me what's going on? Okay, when windows started to get broken and the dining room table ended up in the swimming pool, then they said, okay, let's get Stewart a microphone.
Working from Sting's demos, the three members set about crafting their most ambitious album to date.
We never heard the songs before the day that we were going to play them. And so that morning, what do we got today? And we hear the demo, and we start doing takes of the song. Nah, that's too fast. And Sting's trying to remember that he has to sing it all the time. And as I'm getting faster and faster with every take, he's having to sing. Say, wait a minute, wait. He's got to be able to get the words out of his mouth. Okay, can we keep the tempo to a point where the actual syllables sound like the English language? Okay, I'm going to compromise on that one.
Synchronicity 1, the opening track from the album. This was new ground for the Police. There was a distinct lack of their signature white reggae feel to the album. It was also presented as a concept based on Carl Jung's theory of synchronicity, the idea that two seemingly unrelated events can combine to create something meaningful. Here's Sting explaining the song Synchronicity 2, one of their hit singles from the album.
Synchronicity 2 was about a sort of suburban nightmare, and the story was told juxtaposed with the story of a monster coming out of a lake in Scotland. So as this poor suburban man's life gets worse, his wife nags him, the boss bullies him. He's driving to work like a lemming, in the rush hour. As he gets worse and worse, this monster gets closer and closer to the surface and eventually comes and attacks a village. So it was kind of synchronicity that the symbol for his life and for his madness was this monster.
But the album's standout track was the lead single, Every Breath You Take. It's one of the most famous and played songs in pop music history, and on its release would place the band on the same pedestal as the biggest rock bands in history. Here's music writer John Pidgeon.
Sting was developing this nasty, nice balance in his songs so that you'd get a song like Every Breath You Take, which sounds like a love song, but then when you look more closely into the lyric, it's about repression, suspicion and paranoia and domination. That's true of at least a couple of other songs on the album. What sounds like a pleasant love song, in fact, there's something quite sinister going on below the surface.
I sat at the piano and wrote Every Breath You Take. I knew it was the biggest hit we'd ever have. I knew it was a hit, which is why it was so easy to put it on the album, despite the cries of saying it was simplistic from the other members of the band. But, that was the kind of, that's no disrespect to Andy and Stewart, it was just the kind of climate at the time, it was very, very contentious, very bitter.
Manager Miles Copeland.
What he really wanted was a session drummer who would just do exactly what he said. He was more and more preferring that simple drum beat. He could have used a drum machine. But Stewart didn't like it because the drumming was so simple. He couldn't do any fancy stuff, so he really didn't like that song.
That was a very good instance of Stewart wanting to get his own way because, don't forget, Sting, it was my band. I asked you to join the band.
It needed that straight beat, there was no question about that. The song was a hit. Everybody conceded, okay, they listened to advice, Stewart shut up and did what he was supposed to do.
In 1983, Every Breath You Take spent 8 weeks at number 1 on the US charts and 4 weeks at number 1 in the UK. It was one of the biggest selling singles of the year. It won 2 Grammys, and it's the Police's most famous track. But it wasn't the only song on the album Andy, Stewart and Sting argued over.
Andy and Stewart would come in with songs, and the only drama was really which one Sting would concede that he would do, because those songs were not at the same level of a Sting song.
Producer Hugh Padgham.
There was always a Andy Summers track and a Stewart Copeland track on the album, which many people used to think was to the detriment of the album, Well, I think it probably was, to be honest. Some of Stewart's songs I like, actually, but I wasn't really that keen on Mother. Sting refused to sing Mother. He hated that song. I think we all hated that song, to be honest. Well, it was just Andy screaming about his mother, wasn't it? I mean, it was bizarre, but so bizarre it's sort of funny now.
If Sting had sung it, for one thing, it would have been a lot better. You know, Andy and I like singing. We have certain qualities-ish. There's another song that Andy wrote, which I think would have been a hit. Omega Man. Beautiful song, but it's got Andy singing on it. Bless his heart. As a singer, he's an incredible guitarist.
You know, we were a democracy, or at least we had the semblance of democracy, so you couldn't fire each other. We were in it, and we were trapped in this little world. And telling someone their song stinks, it's like saying their mother's ugly, you know. I mean, it's hard to do, but you have to do it. Otherwise, you have an album full of stuff that's just there because someone wrote it, which isn't good enough.
Sting did contribute vocals on Stewart's only song, though. Producer Hugh Padgham.
Sting took a huge amount of persuasion to sing on Miss Gradenko as well, because he thought it was crap, the song. He hated it, and he would do anything to wind up Stewart at that point as well. I think it was like, oh, right, okay, I'll sing it, and it was like literally 2 takes or something. It was like, there you go.
The band battled on with recording the album, laying down the future Sting-penned hits King of Pain and Wrapped Around Your Finger. And the arguments got worse and worse. Drummer Stewart.
You couldn't just say, I think not, Andy. I think that guitar solo should be else. No, that's not going to work. Andy, that guitar solo is the worst piece of That's the only thing that's going to work. And you probably have to go for the short and curlies anywhere you can find them, particularly with Sting, this mountain of musicology. They were screaming matches.
As a producer, I would try and, come on guys, you know, rather pathetic attempt at trying to sort of diffuse the tension or the situation. And I never forget once Sting just saying, oh, Hugh, what, you know, you've only ever been in the studio with us for like 4 weeks. Don't even bother to try and get in the way of us fighting, sort of thing. Every time there was a fight from then on, I just sort of shrugged my shoulders and looked on until it worked its own way back into sort of some semblance of normality.
For producer Hugh Padgham, the pain didn't end once the recording was finished. The mixing process was still to come.
We were in this studio called Le Studio, and it was in the winter time, and it was a ski resort. But this one occasion, Stewart came in, and Sting wasn't there, and he said, I want to overdub a hi-hat on probably Every Breath You Take or something. It was like, OK, you know, me being the nice democratic producer, let's try it, you know. So anyway, we put the hi-hat on, and then after lunch, Sting comes in, what's that hi-hat doing there? Well, says me, you know, we overdubbed it this morning. Get rid of the hi-hat. You know? So the next time Stewart listens to the song, where's my hi-hat gone, you know?
By the time the record was mastered, the three members found it so difficult to be in the same room together, they shot the photos for the album cover at separate sessions. Rumours then were obviously rife that the band were on the verge of implosion, and their management began to panic that they wouldn't even be able to tour the album. Synchronicity was released in May 1983, and in a promotional interview on Radio 1, the cracks in their relationship were beginning to show.
Are you guys intending to stay together as a unit then after the tour?
After this interview, probably not.
What do you mean?
Well, do you plan on carrying on kind of indefinitely with your solo projects and then coming together?
There's things about the solo projects. Let's not get confused. The solo projects are what keep us together. If it weren't for the solo projects, we would go crazy.
I don't think of them as solo projects. I mean, we're three guys, we're in a band, and we also have we have lives. We do other things as well.
Yeah.
I think we've always maintained the freedom as individuals and as a group to say, well, if tomorrow we don't feel like being a group, we won't be. It's not as if we have to be a group to breathe the air, you know. We're not joined at the hip. We're actually, you know, we have lives that are separate.
It's joined at the wallet.
Right.
Amazingly, the huge global tour went ahead, with the Synchronicity album topping charts all over the world, even knocking Michael Jackson's Thriller album off the top spot in America. Here's music journalist John Pidgeon.
I think it all became more obvious where they were after Synchronicity came out, because that was the tour where they played Shea Stadium in New York, which had been a yardstick for mega stardom ever since the Beatles had played there. So the tour they did after Synchronicity was all stadiums, and it was just huge. They must have been the biggest band in the world.
I mean, I introduced them at Shea Stadium, so I walked out on that stage, you know, ladies and gentlemen, and the place erupted. I was on stage, a minute, and the energy rush, the power of that 80,000 people screaming, I just thought, oh my God. Then I looked back at these three guys. They're on stage for an hour and a half with that. What it must have done to their brains, you know? Walking in your
footsteps. There were physical fights between them. I mean, there's a famous story from when Sting and Stewart, and they were playing a gig in France. They got into a fight, and somehow Stewart broke a rib, and he couldn't play. And so his roadie, Jeff, donned a cap, and so Jeff played the whole Police gig without anybody knowing.
It's not surprising, with all this bad feeling, both in the studio and on stage, that all three members decided that at the end of the 6-month sellout world tour, they would split the band. Drummer Stuart Copeland.
We just couldn't stand that tension anymore. And the work we were doing was really great, but life is so beautiful outside the band. My family loves me. I just wanted to be out of the world, get me out of this cocoon, and the others felt the same way. So, you know, even though each album had gotten bigger, and our last album was our biggest album, it was our swan song, because we just couldn't take it anymore.
At the height of their career, playing to 60,000 plus audiences a night and having sold over 8 million copies of Synchronicity in the USA alone, the Police called it a day. And to date, it remains their last album. So, in the words of Neil Young, is it better to burn out than to fade away?
It was a pretty good swan song album. I think many a band, big bands, say like Led Zeppelin, you know, they struggled on, and their last couple of albums weren't really very good. And I can't imagine that we would have bettered that album. And Sting was already, I think he already had it in his head that he was going to go.
We were called the biggest band in the world, but I knew that there had been other acts that sold more records. We had not yet sold as many records, for instance, as Michael Jackson had. So it was, okay, we're the biggest band in the world, but you know what? I'd like to be here for another album or two to really close the deal. And if I have any bad feeling about it, is that I think we should have done one more album and one more tour to really close the deal.
That sounds like the manager talking, doesn't it? There's one more album there. I mean, I think in retrospect, it probably was the perfect time to stop. I mean, what would they have done on the next tour? 2 nights at Shea Stadium? You know, it's hard to think how they could have topped it.
When you start a band, you all start with the same hopes, the same aspirations, and your position in the band isn't clear. And who became the chief songwriter was just a matter of tradition, you know. But that slowly crystallized. And then once it had crystallized, people wanted to get out of it, you know. So I think the band lasted for the right amount of time. I think another album would have been a disaster.
We did a reunion tour recently, and it was hell. It was heaven and hell. As usual with the Police, there's kind of a mixture of misery and exaltation. It's just such hard work getting along. The getting along part is easy. It's dealing with each other musically. Sting and I love each other, and we show it every way we can, until we start talking about music. Go figure.